In screwed news, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development issued a warning to the 17-nation Eurozone today, saying there's a good chance of a severe recession this year if governments and the European Central Bank don't act quickly to promote economic growth. That's the same message the IMF had for the UK today, calling on the British government to slow down on the austerity and pass stimulus measures to boost demand and grow the economy. Europe is sinking under the weight of vicious austerity measures in places like the UK, Spain, and Greece that have led to economies contracting, unemployment surging, deficits growing, and suicide rates spiking. And the Economic Collapse blog is reporting on a number of warning signs that signal the European banking crisis is only getting worse. For example, 8 times more money has been pulled out of Greek banks than usual in the last few days. 16 Spanish banks have just seen their credit downgraded. 26 Italian banks have also seen their credit downgraded. Spain and Italy are now officially in recessions. Civil unrest is spreading in Italy, and here in the United States, the Paul Ryan Republican budget would have similar effects. Despite Ryan arguing that his budget isn't austerity, an analysis by the Economic Policy Institute found that that budget would kill 4.1 million American jobs. But Ryan is half right. His budget isn't total austerity. It's only austerity for working people, as the Romney-level super-rich make off like bandits under his plan with a $3 trillion tax cut. And given the unrest in the streets in America now, as we just saw in Chicago over the last few days, we can just imagine what another few million Americans out of work to give the super-rich another tax cut would do to our social fabric. Add all of this up, and we could be seeing a massive, once-in-a-lifetime global economic transformation. We could be seeing the collapse of corporate capitalism itself. And if so, what do we replace it with? Gar Alperovitz is here. He's a historian and professor of political economy at the University of Maryland and author of the book, America Beyond Capitalism. Gar, welcome.
Glad to be here.
Great to have you with us. Is this, between the crisis in Europe and the crisis here in the United States, are we seeing the real limits of corporate capitalism? And might this represent an opportunity for some of the alternatives and changes that you're proposing?
I think we're at a turning point. I think there is an era of stagnation, crisis, decay. The political system can't handle the economic system. And I think in that context, people are rightly aware there's something profound wrong. I mean, what really was interesting about Occupy was how the response around the American people was something is wrong. They know that.
Right.
And that's a big turning point in history, and it's the beginning place of any major political change.
So what is the system that you would use to democratize ownership of businesses?
Well, democratization is the right term, because the number that I find all but impossible to understand, but we checked it out many times, the top 400 people, individuals, have more wealth now than the bottom 160 million Americans. That's a medieval ownership pattern. I mean, literally, land ownership was not that concentrated. The alternative is some form of democratization. Worker-owned companies, there are 10,000 of those in the United States today, 10 million people involved. That's a democratic form. Co-ops, very American idea, very decentralized. Land trusts, several hundred of those, where the land is owned by nonprofits, controlled by community associations. Municipal electricity, 25% of American electricity today is supplied by municipal, neighborhood, and co-ops. 25%. So these are different, very decentralized vision of what can be built up, and I think we're seeing a lot more activity of that kind develop at the grassroots level. Obviously, we'll have to talk about larger scale in different parts, but that's the groundwork, because that's what gives people an idea of what's possible, what they can do in their own neighborhoods, what they can do in their own state. And those are the kind of things in the pre-New Deal era that kind of established principles for larger scale regional and national development of different forms of democratization. Now, some of these big banks ought to be turned into public utilities at the national level, I think.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one, and in fact, let's get into that. But also, it seems that what you're talking about is a radical change from the history to this moment. I mean, with the TVA or the Hoover Dam or whatever. The history of General Motors. I mean, there were in the 19-teens there were, I think, more than 100 auto companies in America. So our history has been build it big, build it bigger, centralize. rather than decentralize, and you're talking about going in the opposite direction, are you not, or a different direction?
I think a big part of what's happening, I do think we're going to have to talk about regional and national structures to support a new direction, so we can come back to that.
Sure.
But what I think is really happening is that the pain levels at the local level, with very high unemployment, with fear of unemployment, with families under pressure, people are being forced to do something new, or things get worse. Yeah. Pain is driving a lot of this. Pain and awareness that something new has to happen. So we're seeing this kind of thing all over the country. The unions, for instance, traditionally were only interested in collective bargaining. The steelworkers have now established a whole new strategy of worker union co-ops along the lines of the famous Mondragon strategy, which
co-ops where the workers are owners.
Worker owners, which is not part of the American labor movement's tradition, except way back in the 19th century, the Knights of Labor. Right. So that idea is coming up with labor union support. That's a significant change. We're seeing some states are doing, even if you go up to Alaska, and you see Sarah's Alaska has got public distribution of the resources from oil as a matter of right. In Texas, they don't do it that way. It goes just to the oil companies.
They don't do it anywhere else in the United States that way, do they?
Not that way. Yeah. So there you have a pattern that democratizes the distribution of the oil revenues rather than putting it all. There are lots of examples like that around the country that people are looking at and saying, why can't we do something different in our own state or our own city that would draw on these principles?
Right. I think it was Paul Krugman who said, or maybe it was Elizabeth Warren, we need to very quickly go back to the era when banking was predictable and boring.
That's right.
How does that speak to your concept of banks as utilities?
Well, the traditional model of banking was, boring indeed, because they'd make investment at the local level, looking at the kind of what that store needs, the small factory, the small farm. You knew the person. They used to say it was 333, or go in and work for 3 hours and then go out and play golf for 3 hours because it was such a boring business. Yeah. But now these big banks are basically speculators at the national level. I mean, they have
gamblers.
Gamblers. Their investment side is considered boring, and if you want to make really a career, you do speculation and investment in derivatives and so forth. But it is gambling, and we've seen the results of that, what can happen to the economy. So at the national level, we're going to, the choices have been regulation, and we know we can't regulate them. They can get around the regulators. I used to work on Capitol Hill in the Senate and the House. The lobbyists swarm and get those regulations the way they want them. If you break them up, which I think is the next stage when the next crisis happens, the big fish are going to eat the little fish. You know that, as they've always done. They'll be back at the trough. So at some point, I think the American people are going to be angry enough to say, let's turn some of them into kind of boring public utilities. But that's down the line quite a ways, but I suspect that's the end of the line here, because they're not controllable.
Yeah. Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Act in '82, which led to this explosion of mergers and acquisitions. No president since then has begun seriously enforcing it. Jimmy Carter, I think, was the last one breaking up AT&T. Is that something that should be really high on our priority list?
It should be high, but I take a historian's view of that. The power behind that strategy was liberal power of the traditional kind, and it depended on a strong labor movement. That's what gave it muscle. And I think that's over. The labor movement's gone from 34% of the labor force down to 7%, 6.9%, of 11% total, and 6.9% in the private sector. So I think the muscle to enforce the old regulation or break them up strategy, I think, has declined. Sadly, I come out of that tradition. Yeah. But that may mean things are going to get worse and people get really angry and say, hey, we've got to do something really bold. And I suspect at the national level, that kind of thing is going to happen over the next decades, even though at the local level, we're seeing this other development, which is very rich and expanding and cooperative and worker-owned firms. So there's a couple different things going on, which I think are positive, but long-term and developmental. And in some sense, I think we're laying the groundwork maybe for the next progressive era, but there's a lot of groundwork to lay.
Yeah, and apparently a bit of a rough time to go through. Garth, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Good.
You're a wealth of information.
Thanks for being here.